For this. It is sure to be an exciting talk. Your speaker is going to be Andrew Tudor. He has spent 2 years at the University of Michigan School of Music as an aspiring orchestral trumpet player, before he realized that his musical mind could be applied to other disciplines other than music. And he wrote his undergraduate thesis on the interaction of words and music, and earned a master's in music librarianship, and evolved from being a college librarian to a college administrator who has twice held positions leading the library, information technology, and distance learning. That means he's a glutton for punishment, because he's done it not once, but twice. And he is currently Dean of Libraries and Learning Technology at Wenatchee Valley College. In the fall of 2016, he will complete his doctorate in higher education leadership at Seattle University, and he's also my boss. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Andrew Tudor.
That's Barbara Oldham. Hello, everyone. So, why does this matter? I think that there are probably a lot of people in the room who are very interested in how music works and how music conveys meaning. And a lot of people in the room who are kind of curious about leadership, and probably most people in the room wondering what the heck they have to do with each other. So, I think that just our interest helps. I also think there's another reason, and that's that the world doesn't seem to be getting any simpler. It's between things like politics and climate change and social media, it's a pretty complicated place. And I guess I'm always looking for new ways to understand how things work, and especially how we relate to each other and how we work with each other in our organizations. So I'm just offering this as another way to think about those kinds of things. We use a lot of metaphors besides music to try to understand our organizations. So, for instance, sports, right? Go team! We have a team, we have a quarterback, so a leader, and when things aren't going so well, we say things like, we'll get them next time. We use business, so we've got a company, we've got a CEO, and we say things like, hey, it's a merger, and then, oh, you're redundant. Sorry about that. Politics. So we've got whatever the assembly is, and we've got the elected, and we won, and you're not the committee chair anymore, sorry. I just have to make a little aside that it was interesting looking for clip art for politicians, and what I got was a male wearing a suit with an empty word bubble. We use military, so if there's a unit, whatever it is, or officers, we charge, and if we lose the battle, we'll win the war. So these kind of ways that we talk in the workplace. Of course, I'm suggesting music as a metaphor. So we have an ensemble, we have a conductor. We say things like, hey, it's an all Beethoven program. Go home, saxophones, we don't need you. So we already use metaphors as a way to understand the world, but to me, most of the time they're just sort of mashed up, right? In any given day in the workplace or wherever you spend your time, you might hear all of those kinds of things. So part of the purpose for today is to take one of those, music, and follow it all the way through and see what it has to say about our organizations and about leadership. So broadly, I'm proposing music as a lens or a frame, and this is not a new concept as a way to understand organizations. Lee Boldman and Terrence Steele produced this wonderful book, Reframing Organizations, and they offer 4 frames for understanding organizations. And the idea is there's something going on in the organization and the leader's trying to figure out what it is. You use all 4 frames. You look at it 4 different ways to try to get as much understanding of it as possible. So one of them is we think of it's the structural frame, where we think of the organization as something like a factory or a machine. And that's pretty common. Push here, something pops up over there. That's the way we want the world to work. Another frame, so same problem, leaders looking at it. Here's the second way, looking at the organization and the human resources frame, which is we're a family, and guess what? Families have dynamics, right? Weird things happen inside families, only inside families. There's a political frame where the workplace is a jungle, and it's survival of the fittest, and who's doing what to survive might be what the leader's trying to figure out. And then there's a symbolic frame, so you can think of this as the carnival or the temple. And the notion is that something happens, and you might be looking at a symbol for something that's really happening over here, or the other way around. You're looking at something and you wonder, what does it mean? So I'm suggesting, and I am not in any way suggesting a fifth frame for Bowman and Deal's work, but I like the idea of a frame. And so if I were to use their structure, I would say this is a synergistic frame, and that the metaphor is music. Their frames also have a central concept, and so in this case I would say the central concept for music is finding meaning in complexity. So it would be the central concept. They have an image of a leader, so that might be the conductor, it might be the composer, something like that. They have a basic leadership challenge, and I would say that in the synergistic frame, that what the leader is challenged with is repeatedly gaining new perspectives. How many different ways can I look at something? What are the new ways that I can understand something? So just a little bit here about how we might actually use music as a way to understand organizations. Okay, where did this come from? Well, first of all, it came partly from these two folks in the second row here. Yeah. Dad, as an Episcopal priest on a weekly basis, trying to figure out how to get some idea from 2,000 years ago to work in the modern world. And Mom, as an artist, who does that thing that artists do, where they show you something in the world in a new way, to give you a new way to understand it. So this is a family business, I guess. There is actually a path here, though. I started at the University of Michigan as a music major, and ended up as a English major. And the program I was in, we had to write an undergraduate thesis, and I wrote mine on how words and music meant meaning to each other. Then I ended up one credit short, and I had to construct a class for myself, an independent study with a professor. And I did kind of a similar thing with a poem and making it visual. I wrote the poem out in one line instead of the regular structure. And then every time I found some sort of pattern, I made a mark above that line to represent what kind of pattern that was, so that by the time I was done, I had this sort of visual representation of everything that was going on inside the poem. So that's kind of where that started. Then I ended up in the work world, and as Barb said, I had responsibilities for the library, distance learning, and information technology. And those people don't always like each other. In most organizations, most colleges, they're separate organizations. They don't like each other. They don't talk to each other. Here I had them all together, and it was natural to me to say, how do we make this work together? From a musician's perspective, how do we make sense out of this? How do we actually make something beautiful out of this? And I know how corny that sounds, and that's why I'm glad to have the chance here to talk about it in some more breadth and depth. Most recently, I've been at Seattle University for the last 3 years in a doctoral program, and each year of the program, there was a different emphasis on leadership. So the first year was leader as self, the second year was leader in the organization, and the third year was leader in a global and multicultural world. And in that last year, we had the assignment to do a TED-style talk for our classmates, and so I did mine on music and leadership. And so that's really kind of where this specific presentation started. That was 8 minutes, so very different from this. So let's dig in. I want to look at the foundational idea here that the complex interaction between music and text creates meaning. We're going to do this a couple of ways. When you have the same text and it's been set to different music. So we'll look at an example of that. than the other way, where you've got one melody and different texts have been set to it. We'll also take a very brief look at the same music in similar texts, because there's kind of something interesting there about what's going on when we take this into the organization, what's going on there. If I had time, I would do the same music in the same text, which you would normally call a cover, because that's also kind of interesting if you really think that through into an organization, but I don't have time for that. So here's our first example, one text. So pretend that you don't know anything about this song. What kind of music would you imagine going with those words? You've got words like, it ain't no trick to get rich quick, and dig, 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 and off to work. We don't know what we're digging for. Hi-ho. What kind of music would you imagine going along with that? Upbeat?
Ragtime.
Ragtime? Okay.
Appalachian.
All right. Coal mining country. Okay. So we're going to listen to a couple of different versions. So here's first. Okay, so that's that upbeat, happy, it's not ragtime, but that's kind of what you were thinking. I'm going to play two clips from another version, and the first clip is a long introduction, which is actually very important to how this particular version works. And then I'll stop and I'll play the second one. By the way, we all know how the hi-ho part goes, right? So sing it with me. Hi-ho, hi-ho. Okay, that's enough, thank you. All right, here's the second example. Okay. And then here's that's Tom Waits, and here's Waits' version of the hi-ho chorus. Those are happy minors. The interaction between words and music, same words, different music, totally different meaning. So you take this idea into the organization, you're going to see how that interaction can be very helpful to leaders. Okay, so now let's take another look at the idea, but the other way around. So you know this melody, Green Sleeves, and I am going to ask you again to help me sing it. Okay, good. When you hear a melody like that, what kind of words come to mind? Romantic. Christmas?
Vietnam.
Vietnam?
Bad Philippines.
probably a memory associated with that. Okay. Sentimental? Okay, all right. So, two texts. This is the one that people probably know mostly. So it's religious text. It's actually the later text. This is the original text. Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously, for I have loved you well and long, delighting in your company. So she broke up with him. You kind of have to go into the stratosphere of metaphors here to figure out what they have in common, which is love. You know, we can't go too much farther than that. The religious text has this kind of wondering, odd feeling to it. The secular text is, what the hell, you heartbreaker. With the music, however, if you think that melody all the way through, it goes from this kind of quiet, being in the moment, to something glorious or wonderful. And both of them do that. And I think that that actually works with both texts. So in this complex interaction, the theme is the same, the words are different, but the emotion at the center is the same. Two people each thinking about another person and applying the same emotion without very different circumstances. Okay, we're going to race past the next example. It's really just kind of a variation of the Greensleeves idea, but there are some interesting implications here. This is Aura Lee, a Civil War era song. I gotta make sure I've got my slides. And it turns out Elvis Presley, actually a songwriter for Elvis Presley, took that same melody and wrote Love Me Tender. So we've got a Civil War era love song, and we've got Love Me Tender. And the Civil War song is very poetic, really says that nature is inspired by the beauty of whoever the object of the singer's affection is. Whereas Elvis is just sort of straight up, I can imagine him kind of leaning on a soda fountain next to his date saying, come on, baby, love me. But in the end, they get to the same idea, which is, if you love me, I'll be yours forever. So again, if you think about it kind of in the organization, we've got the same words, or we've got the same melody, different words, but we're getting to the same place. Somehow that works. Okay, now I mentioned that I'd done a little kind of a visual thing with the poem, so I'm going to illustrate that here too. So, sing with me, we're going to do the whole thing. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The tenors aren't paying attention. This is what you just did, right? Each line rises and we get to this peak. We shall overcome someday, that's the peak, and then it descends. So that's the melodic shape, and what I'm going to say is that that's like the direction of our organization or our business. Where are we going? What does this, you know, if we can listen to the organization, what is it saying about where we're going? So that shape kind of looks like this, which makes me think of hills, somebody on a journey walking across hill after hill after hill. So you've got this kind of constant rise and fall, and then if you bring in the other verses, actually the structure of the song and the structure of the meaning of the song does that also, where that middle verse is the peak. We shall all be free, and then in the next line, yeah, but it ain't gonna be easy, right? We're sort of coming back down the other side of the hill, but then we do it over and over again. So there's the structure of the melody mimics the structure of the song and the meaning of the text, both at the verse level and at the song level. So again, at the moment, this is kind of the simple way to say this is the leader can listen to an organization and find out where it's going. We're going to say a lot more about that. So my goal with these previous slides has been just to establish this idea that there's an interaction between words and music, and that it's meaningful. And the next question is, how does this translate to our organizations? So I think there's two key ideas here. What we do is like the lyrics in a song. That's what I'm going to base this on. What we do in the workplace, in our organizations, it's like the lyrics in a song. How we do it is like the melody. So that's another basis for how this metaphor works for us. So we're going to look at it three ways. There's the straight up corny joke alert, no bars held analogy. An organization is like a piece of music. Then there's the meta-analysis, which is going to be, we're going to look at leadership theories and look at them as a kind of music each. And then there's a literal interpretation, which is how we create music informs leadership. So the first one, organizations are musical. We're going to look at these first two in some depth, but here are a handful of ways to look at this. Musical themes are like corporate missions. We already talked about this a little bit. Melodic shape, current direction. Harmony could be thought of as what the work environment feels like, but it could also be, is our organization in harmony with what our constituents want or need? Rhythm in a piece of music could be thought of as business cycles where they've got beginning, middle, and end, repetition, certain rhythmic patterns, and same kind of thing with structure. The structure of a song could have a lot to do with how we go about our work. Where does it start? How do we know we're making progress? Where does it end? That sort of thing. From a leadership perspective, this idea that organizations are musical could include these kinds of things. Who's doing a solo right now? You just look around the organization, who's doing what? Who's providing a new interpretation of what we do? Is this a new thing that's happening right now, or is this just theme and variation? Hey, we've got the same melody going on, different words, or same words, different melody, but are we still getting to the same place? Just like with Aura Lee and Love Me Tender, they still got to the same place in the end. And so we're going to look at these two in a little bit more depth. Theme and mission. I wish I sort of think of this talk as the beginning of a 10-week course on this idea, and I would have taken all of those other ideas like rhythmic structure and unpacked them, but we only have time to do two. So the idea that theme is mission. You might hear these four notes as a set of triplets that happen on the beat. Okay, so that's mission. We're going here. Or you might hear them like this, like 3/8 notes that start off the beat. Sounds the same, but it's represented in two different ways. So what's the difference? One's on the beat, so that's a different kind of energy. There are 3 beats, and then the triplets, and then you go on. The other one, on the 8th notes, there are 2 beats, and then a downbeat, and then you start. So there's kind of an anticipation to it, as opposed to starting right on the beat. And this is how Beethoven wrote it. So he did the second case. If we think about this within the organization, if I think the mission is this, and you think the mission is that, and we're apparently going in the same direction, at some point someone's going to have to say, hey, wait a minute, we're not quite on the same page. And that's what Beethoven does in the first movement of that symphony. You hear that pattern a whole bunch of different ways through the first half of the movement, and then there's a full stop, total silence in the middle of the first movement, and we return to that first statement of the theme. So it's like Beethoven is saying, yeah, all that other stuff is valid and it's good, it's interesting, but I'm going to remind you, this is the theme, this is our mission. It kind of lines up with what leaders can do in organizations. Okay, another kind of, sort of the, we shall overcome example, but how melodic shape equals organizational direction. So we're going to use John Rutter's Requiem, a piece from a Requiem, Out of the Deep. So the piece starts with a solo cello in a very low pitch, and it rises, and it's very plaintive, it's very spare. And once the theme is completely stated, then the choir comes in with the text. And so when they come in, I'm gonna reveal that text to you so that you see that. So I think that's just about a perfect example of the meaning of the music and the way it's conveyed through the melodic shape that's starting very low and rising and also being very spare. I think it's a beautiful alignment with the meaning of the text. Out of the deep, have I called unto thee, or Lord, hear my call. That's a magnificent piece of music if you don't know. So I think that's, again, we can do that in our organizations. We can say, is what we say we do and how we do it, are those two things going in the same direction? Do they have the same shape, or are they different? If they're different, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that there's some sort of energy there that we could capture. It's just something that the leader needs to know. Okay, on the downhill side of the presentation here, and I want to just say a few things about leadership. It hasn't always been a thing. We've had leaders for as long as we've been organized as human beings, but most of those people got there through power and might or birth, right? There wasn't any, in 17th century England, there wasn't a little kid running around saying, oh, I'd like to have a leadership position someday. It didn't exist. You didn't have that opportunity. So it's really toward the end of the 19th century that scholars start identifying it, naming it, and saying, can we understand what this is and how it works? And of course, that's the Industrial Revolution, where a little kid could run around in England and say, I'd like to have a leadership position someday. Leadership can be learned. The common notion for a long time has been that you had to have leadership traits and you had to land in a position because you got power from the position and you only got there if you had certain traits. Nonsense. Leadership can be learned. I've got stacks of books with all kinds of, many more than this, with all kinds of studies, research, and all kinds of methods that have been developed on how you can learn. And all you have to do is look at the millennial generation who say, really? You think that there have to be traits and you have to be in a certain position to lead? I don't think that's nonsense. Leadership evolves, and I just think about Gates and Zuckerberg and how they have to change their leadership. Actually Gates with this foundation, I guess, is still doing this. They've had to change their leadership practices over and over and over again because the business they're in evolves so fast. Businesses do this too. I read an article in the New York Times last week that General Electric is going to become a software company. Right? They build locomotives and all that kind of stuff. What they really want to corner the market on is the software that runs factories and globalized engineering. So something's happening on the factory floor, and there's an engineer somewhere in Germany, and they can make that instant connection through the software so that there isn't any back and forth. They can just make the change. So leadership evolves. So if we're going to talk about leadership, we ought to define it, and I thought I would say a few things about it. Okay. Now, this section is, we had that idea of organizations are musical. Now I want to step back from that and look at several leadership theories that are out there. You'll recognize quite a few of them, and say, how are they musical? So the first one is charismatic leadership. So this is not somebody with a charismatic personality who just walks into the room and everybody swoons and does whatever that person says. Charismatic leadership is actually comes when somebody recognizes a need that nobody else knows is out there, imagines a unique, revolutionary way of meeting that need, and then convinces people to follow, to provide resources, to get organized and create that thing. So who knew that we needed iPhones? If I were to describe this as a kind of music, I would say Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring, when that totally revolutionary kind of music, the first time that's played, riots in the streets. But now I think it's essential. We can't have the world without Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. It's that kind of thing is essential. Servant leadership, again, commonly misunderstood, where the servant is some sort of person who's saying, how are you, is everything okay, and taking care of everybody's everything going on all the time. That's not really what it is. It's developed by a fellow named Robert Greenleaf. And if there is a metaphor, it's the gardener. And what this person does is they understand the big picture, and they know the people at the individual levels and help individuals develop the capacity to move with their group toward whatever that big picture is. They don't look like a leader. They look like one of the group. But they have that capacity to know the big picture and to help individuals grow in whatever ways necessary for the whole group to move forward. So if I were to think of this as a kind of music, I would think of working or traveling songs. So you're building a railroad and you're hammering spikes in and you're singing to keep the rhythm down. Somebody started that song and somebody keeps it going. And somebody knows when they need a different kind of song. Situational leadership is one in which the leader changes the leadership style or approach according to whatever is going on at the moment. So the alternative to this is I am always going to lead in the same way. You can hit me with anything and I'm going to respond with one leadership style. Well, that doesn't always work. You're going to miss quite a few with that. So the situational leadership steps back. Leader steps back and says, what kind of leader do I need to be in this particular situation? I think of this as a big band, a directed jazz band, not an improvisational group, where there's a lot of control, but yeah, you do have moments where there's improvisation. So that might be the kind of music for that leadership style. Traditional leadership, so this is leaders are born, not made. There's positional power. I'm the boss, he's the boss. It's usually a guy at the top of the food chain, and this is the only thing I could think of. There's a set of empowering leadership models. So Kouzes and Posner, Covey with the 7 Habits, Burns, who created the idea of transactional or transformational leadership. The basic idea is it's very similar to the servant leadership. The leader helps the followers grow and grow in whatever direction the organization is going. You can become the right person for the job. So you're not a cog in a wheel and we're going to take you out and stick another one in. We're going to grow you into the person that you need to be. I think of this as 7th grade band class. Great, Jimmy, you only missed 5 notes that time. You're getting better, keep trying. There's also our leaderless movements, and 2 of note, civil rights and Occupy Wall Street. Civil rights, Dr. Martin Luther King did not consider himself a leader of the civil rights movement. The voice, maybe. And Occupy Wall Street really didn't end up with leaders, which is, or a voice, which is why it failed. They kind of got their voices late. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, after the movement was kind of dead, right? But that's why they didn't survive, is that they didn't have a voice. In both cases, what happens is a bunch of somebodies observe that something is happening and that it matters, and they all want to do something about it. There isn't one person standing over here saying, hey, this thing is happening, you better look at it, and by the way, I'm going to tell you what to do about it. That role isn't there. in a leaderless movement. I think of this as found music, which is kind of two ideas. One is you're listening to rain dripping off a roof and you realize that it's musical somehow. The other is you go out and you record the garbage truck going down the street and the cat wailing and the rain, and you craft it into something musical. So I think of that when I think of, and by the way, it could be that Occupy Wall Street didn't make it because they couldn't unroll the banner all the way. There are also a bunch of systems theories of leadership. Peter Senge with the Fifth Discipline, Heifetz, Wheatley, who looked at leadership through the lenses of quantum physics and Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics, the world is a giant machine. Quantum physics, everything is connected, and what those implications are for leadership. So in all of those, Senge said it best, the leader's role is continually to find new perspectives on what apparently is chaos. And Senge is the one who says, go to the balcony and look at the people who are dancing. And somebody said recently, this group of people is doing a polka, this group of people is waltzing, and the leader's job is to say, what music are you listening to? This is the image because in a fern, the closer you look, you see the same pattern repeated over and over and over again, and that's what happens in chaotic systems. You just can't see it. Here you just see the fern. You don't realize what's happening down kind of at the chaotic level. I think of this as modern jazz, so where you do have a jazz quintet, and you have to learn how to listen to it. You can't just put Charlie Parker in and go, yeah, I get it. You have to know how to listen. And it sounds like chaos, but once you realize kind of what all the different people are doing and how it's the same, you can start to figure out how it makes sense. So I have this, the slides we just covered in the matrix. If you're interested, I've got more detail, the role of the leader, the follower, the key ideas, the typical context, the key authors. If you're interested, just give me your email address and I'll send you a copy. Okay. Collaboration. So this is a third section. This is our last section. I said I was going to talk about this, and so I am. And the thing is, I don't really believe in collaboration. I believe in collective impact. I learned about it through these two authors, Kania and Kramer. It's only about 5 or 6 pages. It's very well written, very accessible, and it describes very clearly what the difference between collaboration and collective impact is. Collaborators will have a common vision, but they each have their own agenda. And collective impact effort, you give up whatever your own agenda is. And I'll give an example. Let's say you've got third graders in a school district and they're not at reading level, and we know that that's the school prison pipeline, that the government looks at how many third graders are not at reading level, that tells them how many prison beds to create when that group gets to a certain age. So the community says, let's get together and do something about this. And one person says, they don't have enough food, so we're going to provide food. Somebody says, we're going to tutor them in the afternoon. Another group, third organization says, we're going to help the parents. So they all come together with this vision, and they say, we're going to all do our part, and it's going to work. A year later, they haven't moved the needle. Nothing's happened. And the reason is that they're at the table, but they're really trying to make sure that their own organization is successful. In collective impact, you have the same idea, you all have your own strengths, but you set aside whatever it is that you're concerned about your organization is, and you say that collective goal is more important, which means the leader of the organization is going to go back to the board and have a very difficult conversation, because that's not how we usually do business. That's one difference between collaboration and collective impact. Another one is that in a collective impact effort, you find a third party to manage the effort, and that person creates and manages the budget, does the purchasing, hires people, does marketing, sets meeting times, gets people together. Because if you think about it, if you're a group that feeds hungry people and you have to do all this other stuff, you're not really putting all of your effort into the feeding part. You're doing all that other stuff. And also there's the neutrality of the third party organizing everything, so that there isn't one group that's the lead group really following their own agenda. So a couple of quotes here. Doesn't happen often because, not because it's impossible, because it's so rarely attempted. This is from the Kenya article. Social change comes from better cross-sector coordination than isolated intervention of individual organizations, which is what I described in that reading level thing, that's really a group, an organized group of isolated interventions. It's not really collaboration or collective impact. And it requires players to change their behavior. So like I said, the leader has to go back and say, has to change their own behavior, and then has to go back to the organization and say, the organization needs to change its behavior for this to be successful. Okay. Doesn't happen often, not because it's impossible. Yeah, but musicians do it all the time. You have an idea of how Beethoven's Fifth should be played, and you're the second clarinet player. Are you going to go into rehearsal and play it your way? That would be fun. Let's say you believe in a different tempo. Let's see. Better cross-sector coordination. It's usually better when the altos set aside their own aspirations and the tenors set aside their own aspirations, and everybody just buys into the collective sound that we're trying to produce. Change in behavior. So this one is a little bit of a stretch. I think that person jumping off the rope, I think of as one of the best conductors that I ever had, Carl St. Clair at the University of Michigan in the wind ensemble. And just an example of how he sort of let go of traditional ways of leading organizations. We were playing a piece and he wanted the brass to have a darker sound, and he would have said, brass, darker sound, or more trombones, or something like that. But instead he said, brass, blow cool air through your horns. It's impossible to blow cool air through the trumpet, right? But our sound darkened up and we sounded like the Berlin Philharmonic playing Mahler. It was crazy. So he let go of a way of explaining what the mission was, and we came up with the how. And we changed our behavior. We didn't just say, no, what's this crazy cool air stuff? We bought it and we did it. Okay. We, I hope, established the idea that there's meaning that comes from the interaction of words and music. So the orally and all of those different kinds of examples that we had. And that those concepts of meaning and complexity can transfer into how we look at leadership in organizations. We looked at the idea that organizations are musical, and we looked at leadership styles and thought of them as kinds of music, and we looked at how we produce music to create collective impact, can inform how we work in the world. In that collective impact model, we give up a part of ourselves so that we can give the best part of ourselves to a greater purpose. That concludes my talk. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes.
Andrew, I was wondering if in your process of reading and thinking about this subject, did you have any interaction with the work of Plato, and if so, to what extent? Plato, the Greek philosopher. if I didn't enunciate that.
No, some of the leadership theories do, but I didn't encounter that explicitly in working with it.
It strikes me that this is an interesting sort of elaboration on Plato's idea. Plato argued that the ideal leader of an ideal state should be trained in music, because music teaches harmony. And the point of the leader is to orchestrate the different parts to play at the same time to be an effectively harmonious state. And I've always found that a really intriguing idea from a philosophical perspective.
So
Strikes
I
the elaboration
knew that
there.
at one time, and one thing I left out was some of my own thinking about what I call musical thinking, which is that as a musician, you're simultaneously thinking linearly and vertically because you're managing rhythm and harmony through time, and you're listening to what everybody else is doing. And that to me, so that business about running distance learning, technology, library, that musical thinking idea is kind of how I got to that.
So Andrew, what I thought you were doing here, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I thought you were doing here is you were presenting a new lens, a new way, a new innovative way of gaining perspective on leadership, on organization, and raising awareness and just a different way of taking a perspective on that. Did this affect you and how you see this organization, how you see your leadership? If this is what you were doing, and then you must have turned around and started saying, whoa, I'm seeing new stuff here at Wenatchee Valley College, here in myself. And if so, what did you come up with?
Yeah, by the way, I have looked to see if there are other people who have written on this particular lens, and I haven't found very much. So there must be somebody out there, and I just have none of them. There are a couple of things. One is the true wonder of working in an interdisciplinary manner, which to me is musical. So I sometimes say I spend half my day trying to give away information in libraries as hard as I can, the other half of the day in information technology, protecting it just as hard as I can. And so how do I go home at night, right? There is a harmony there. And also I think in conflict, there's something that's kind of interesting because this idea of there's a pattern in chaos, you just can't see it. So when you're in the middle of conflict, you're leading through conflict, you can find that. You can find out what's happening in that chaotic situation. And once you reveal that, what I find is that that's the point that everybody can start from. So there are some ways that it's affected me in my workshop.
Why is it that you think the collective impact is so rarely attended?
It's a relatively new idea. I haven't, for instance, I haven't seen the collective impact book, just a couple of articles like that. I think that there are people who, now that we're working in a global context, and people are starting to look around and see how things are successful in other parts of the world, they're seeing things like the person who brought electrification to rural Brazil really did this same thing. There wasn't a name for it, of getting people to buy in and say that rural electrification is more important than whatever my organization is. And they've worked past big money Brazilian resistance for that. It just didn't have a name as collective impact. And so that would be my understanding of why we aren't just dumping collaboration and going, because it's not well known.
Well, it's funny that you would say that. I have two seemingly opposing degrees as well. One in performance and then the other in music business. So I always get these similar questions. But what I'm kind of noticing and kind of making this connection, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is that collective impact seems like it, in the musician world, always lends more toward an organic, a more organic experience musically, that there's more ebb and flow, and that if you have a connection to each other that is more than just hi, how are ya, that your music and your musicianship is better. Well, it seems that collective impact could actually promote more organic growth and change for better culture and ideation in the business world, just like it does in musicality and musicianship.
So I think it's one reason that you see startups outsourcing stuff like payroll and setting up meetings and even office space and all that kind of stuff, because they want to do what they are best at. They don't want to have to do all that other stuff. And then if you get several organizations who are really nailing it because they're not spending any of their energy on business processes, then that group can be very powerful because everybody's bringing what they do absolutely best.
It's more team play.